Section 19 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. The Bridals of Ysselmonde. When the Grand Duke Ferdinand of Carinthia travelled in state to wed the Princess Sophia of Ysselmonde, he did so by land, and for two reasons, the first being that this was the shortest way, and the second that he possessed no ships. These, at any rate, were the reasons alleged by his chancellor, to whom he left all arrangements. For himself, he took very little interest in the marriage, beyond inquiring the age of his bride. 6 years was the answer, and this seemed to him very young, for he had already passed his 10th birthday. The Pope, however, had contrived and blessed the match, so Ferdinand raised no serious objection, but in due course came to Ysselmonde with his bodyguard of the famous green Corinthian archers, and 200 halberdiers and 12 wagons, 4 to carry his wardrobe, and the remaining 8 piled with wedding presents. On the way, while Ferdinand looked for birds' nests, the Chancellor sang the praises of the Princess Sophia, who, he declared, was more beautiful than the day. "But you have never seen her," objected Ferdinand. "No, your Highness, and that is why I contented myself with a purely conventional phrase." And the Chancellor, who practised finesse in his odd moments, began to talk of the sea, the sight of which awaited them at Ysselmonde. "And what is the sea like?" "Well, your Highness, the sea is somewhat difficult to describe, for in fact there is nothing to compare with it." "You have seen it, I suppose?" "Sire, I have done more. For once, while serving as ambassador at Venice, I had the honour to be upset in it." With such converse they beguiled the road until they reached Ysselmonde, and found the sea completely hidden by flags and triumphal arches. And there, after 3 days' feasting, the little Grand Duke and the still smaller Princess were married in the cathedral by the Cardinal Archbishop, and the Pope's legate handed them his master's blessing in a morocco-covered case, and as they drove back to the palace the Dutchmen waved their hats and shouted "Boomp!" but the Corinthian archers cried "Talesio!" which not only sounded better, but proved, when they obligingly explained what it meant, that the ancestors of the Grand Duke of Carinthia had lived in Rome long before any pope. On reaching the palace, the bride and bridegroom were taken to a gilded drawing-room, and there left to talk together, while the guests filled up the time before the banquet by admiring the presents and calculating their cost. Ferdinand said, "Well, that's over," and the Princess said, "Yes," for this was their first opportunity of conversing alone. "You're a great deal better than I expected," said Ferdinand reassuringly. Indeed, in her straight dress, sewn with seed pearls, and her coif of Dutch lace surmounted with a little crown of diamonds, the Princess looked quite beautiful, and he in his white satin suit, crossed with the blue ribbon of St. John Nepomuk, was the handsomest boy she had ever seen. Besides, he added. "My chancellor says you are hereditary High Admiral of the Ocean. It's in the marriage settlement, and that would make up for a lot. Where is it?" "The ocean?" She felt very shy still. "I've never seen it, but I believe it's somewhere at the bottom of the garden." "Suppose we go and have a look at it." She was about to say that she must ask leave of her governess, but he looked so masterful and independent that she hadn't the courage. It gave her quite a thrill as he took her hand and led her out through the low window to the great stone terrace. They passed down the terrace steps into a garden ablaze with tulip beds in geometrical patterns. At the foot ran a yew hedge, and beyond it, in a sidewalk, they came upon a scullion boy chasing a sulphur yellow butterfly. The Grand Duke forgot his fine manners and dropped his bride's hand to join in the chase. But the boy no sooner caught sight of him than he fled with a cry of dismay and popped into an arbour. There, a minute later, the bride and bridegroom found him stooping over a churn and stirring with might and main. "What are you stirring, boy?" asked Ferdinand. "Praised be the Virgin," said the boy. "I believe it's an ice pudding for the banquet. But they shouldn't have put the ice puddings in the same arbour as the fireworks, for, if your Highness will allow me to say so, you can't expect old heads on young shoulders." "Are the fireworks in our honour too?" "Why, of course," the scullion answered. "Everything is in your honour today." This simplified matters wonderfully. The children passed on through a gate in the garden wall and came upon a clearing beside a wood stack, and there stood a caravan with its shafts in the air. A woman sat on the tilt at the back reading, and every now and then glancing towards two men engaged in deadly combat in the middle of the clearing, who shouted as they thrust at one another with long swords. The little princess, who, except when driven in her state coach to the cathedral, had never before strayed outside the garden, turned very pale and caught at her husband's hand. But he stepped forward boldly. "Now yield thee, caitiff, or thine hour has come," shouted one of the fighters, and flourished his blade. "Sooner I'll die than tum-de-tum-de-tum," the other answered quite as fiercely. "Slave of thine become," said the woman from the caravan. "Thank you. Sooner I'll die than slave of thine become." He laid about him with a fresh vigour. "Put down your swords," commanded Ferdinand. "And now tell me who you are." "We are Valentine and Orson," they answered. "Indeed?" Ferdinand had heard of them and shook hands affably. "Then I'm very glad to make your acquaintance." "And," said they, "we are rehearsing for the performance at the palace tonight in your Highness's honour." "Oh, so this is in our honour too?" "To be sure," said the woman, "and I am to dress up as Hymen and speak the epilogue in a saffron robe. It has some good lines. For instance, 'Ye loves and genial hours conspire to gratify this royal pair, with sons impetuous as their sire, and daughters as their mother fair.'" "Thank you," said Ferdinand, "but we're very busy to-day and must take one thing at a time. Can you tell us the way to the sea, please?" The woman pointed along a path which led to a moss-covered gate and an orchard where the apple blossom piled itself in pink clouds against the blue sky. As they followed the path they heard her laughing, and looked back to see her still staring after them and laughing merrily, while Valentine and Orson leaned on their swords and laughed too. The orchard was the prettiest in the whole world. Blackbirds played hide and seek beneath the boughs. Blue and white violets hid in the tall grass around the boles, and the spaces between were carpeted with daisies to the edge of a streamlet. Over the streamlet sang thrushes and goldfinches and bullfinches innumerable, and their voices shook down the blossom like a fall of pink snow which threatened to cover even the daisies. The Grand Duke and the Princess believed that all this beauty was in their honour, no less than the chorus of the bells floating across the tree tops from the city. "This is the best of all," said Ferdinand, as they seated themselves by the stream. "I had no idea marriage was such fun, and they haven't even forgotten the trout," he cried, peering over the brink. "Can you make daisy chains?" asked the Princess timidly. He could not, so she taught him, feeling secretly proud that there was something he could learn of her. When the chain was finished, he flung it over his neck and kissed her. "Though I don't like kissing as a rule," he explained. "And this shall be my wedding present," said she. "Why, I brought you 6 wagon loads, beauties, all chosen by my Chancellor." "But he didn't make or choose this one," said Sophia, "and I like this one best." They sat silent for a moment. "Dear me," she sighed, "what a lot we have to learn of each other's ways. Hello!" Ferdinand was staring down the glade. "What's that line at the end there across the sky?" Sophia turned. "I think that's the sea. Yes, there is a ship upon it." "But why have they hung a blue cloth in front of it?" "I expect that's in our honour too." They took hands and trotted to the end of the orchard, and there, beyond the hedge, ran a canal, and beyond the canal a wide flat country stretched away to the sea, a land dotted with windmills and cattle and red and white houses with weathercocks, a land, too, criss-crossed with canals, whereon dozens of boats and even some large ships threaded their way like dancers in and out of the groups of cattle, or sailed past a house so closely as almost to poke a bowsprit through the front door. The weathercocks spun and glittered, the windmills waved their arms, the boats bowed and curtsied to the children. Never was such a salutation. Even the blue cloth in the distance twinkled, and Ferdinand saw at a glance that it was embroidered with silver. But the finest flash of all came from a barge moored in the canal just below them, where a middle-aged woman sat scouring a copper pan. "Good day!" cried Ferdinand across the hedge. "Why are you doing that?" "Why, in honour of the wedding, to be sure. Must show one's best at such times, if only for one's own satisfaction." Then, as he climbed into view and helped Sophia over the hedge, she recognized them, and dropping her pan with a clatter, called on the saints to bless them and keep them always. The bridal pair clambered down to the towpath, and from the towpath to her cabin, where she fed them, for they were hungry by this time, with bread and honey from a marvellous cupboard painted all over with tulips. In short, they enjoyed themselves immensely. "Only," said Ferdinand, "I wish they hadn't covered up the sea, for I wanted a good look at it." "The sea?" said the barge woman, all of a shiver. Then she explained that her 2 sons had been drowned in it. "Though, to be sure," said she, "they died for your Majesty's honour, and if God should give them back to me, would do so again." "For me?" exclaimed Sophia, opening her eyes very wide. "Ay, to be sure, my dear. So it's no wonder, that I should love you." By the time they said good-bye to her and hurried back through the orchard, a dew was gathering on the grass, and a young moon had poised herself above the apple boughs. The birds here were silent, but high on the stone terrace, when they reached it, a solitary one began to sing. From the bright windows facing the terrace came the clatter of plates and glasses, with loud outbursts of laughter. But this bird had chosen his station beneath a dark window at the corner, and sang there unseen. It was the Nightingale. They could not understand what he sang. "It is my window," whispered Sophia, and began to weep in the darkness, without knowing why, for she was not miserable in the least, but, on the contrary, very, very happy. They listened hand in hand by a fountain on the terrace. Through the windows they could see the papal legate chatting at table with the king, Sophia's father, and the chancellor hobnobbing with the cardinal archbishop. Only the Queen of Ysselmonde sat at the table with her wrists on the arms of her throne, and her eyes looking out into the darkness, as though she caught some whisper of the bird's song. But the children knew that he sang for them, not for her, for he told of all the adventures of the day. And he told not as I am telling them, but so beautifully that the heart ached to hear. Yet his song was of 2 words only: young, 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 love, love, love. The same words, over and over. A courtier came staggering out from the banqueting hall, and the bird flew away. The children standing by the fountain watched him as he found the water and dipped his face in it, with a groan. He was exceedingly drunk, but as he lifted his head he caught sight of them in the moonlight and excused himself. "In your Highness's honour," he assured them. "Been doing my best." "Poor man," said Sophia, "but how loyal!" End of section 19.
Section 20 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. England. At Madeira, 7 of us were added to the first-class passengers of the Cambuscan, homeward bound from Cape Town, and even so the company made a poor muster in the saloon, which required 170 feet of hurricane deck for covering. Those were days, long before the South African War, before the Jameson raid even, when every ship carried out a load of miners from the Transvaal, and returned comparatively empty, though as a rule with plenty of obviously rich men and be-diamonded ladies. But every tide has its backwash, and it so happened that the Cambuscan held as many second and third class passengers as she could stow. They were, their general air proclaimed it, the failures of South African immigration. Men and women who had gone out too early and given up the struggle just when the propitious moment arrived. Seediness marked the second class. The third class came from all parts, from the Cape to Pietermaritzburg, but they might have conspired to assemble on the Cambuscan as a protest against high hopes and dreams of a promised land. The protest, let me add, was an entirely passive one. They stood aloof, watching the flashy gaieties of the hurricane deck from their own sad penumbra, a dejected, wistful, whispering throng. "They simply don't occur," one of the be-diamonded ladies remarked to me, and went on to praise the U-line for arranging it so. With nightfall or a trifle later they vanished, and at most When the time came for my last pipe before turning in, 2 or 3 figures would be left pacing there forward, pacing and turning and pacing again. I wondered who these figures were and what their thoughts. They and the sleepers hive beneath them belonged to another world, a world driven with ours through wave and darkness, urged by the same propellers, controlled by the same helmsman, separated only by thin partitions which the touch of a rock would tear down like paper, and yet, while the partitions stood, separated as no city separates its rich and poor. Only on Sundays did these 2 worlds consent to meet. They had, it appeared, a common God, and joined for a few minutes once a week in worshipping him. The be-diamonded lady, however, was not quite accurate. Once and once only, it was the second day out from Madeira, the third-class passengers did occur, to the extent of organizing athletic sports, and even, with the captain's leave, of levying prize money from the saloon deck. Some 4 or 5 of us, when their delegate approached, were lounging beneath the great awning and listening, or pretending to listen, to the discourse of our only millionaire, Mr. Olstein. As usual, he recited his wrongs, and as usual, the mere recital caused him to perspire. The hairs on the back of his expostulatory hand bristled with indignation. The diamonds on his fingers flashed with it. We had known him but 2 days, and were passing weary of him, but allowed him to talk. He apostrophized the British flag. His final court of appeal, he termed it, while we stared out over the waters. "We love it," he insisted. "We never see it without a lump in our throats. But we ask ourselves, how long is this affection to count for nothing? What are we to get in return?" No one answered, perhaps because no one knew. My thoughts had flown forward to a small riverside church in England, and a memorial window to one whose body had been found after Isandlwana, with the same flag wrapped around it beneath the tunic. This was his reward. "Hey, what's this?" Mr. Olstein took the subscription list, fitted his gold-rimmed glasses, and eyed the delegate over the paper. "Athletic sports? Not much in your line, I should say." "No, sir." And while the delegate bent his eyes, a bright spot showed on either cheek. He was a weedy, hollow-chested man, about 6 feet in height, with telltale pits at the back of the neck, and a ragged beard evidently grown on the voyage. "I'm only a collector, with the captain's permission." "I see." Mr. Olstein pulled out a sovereign. "I don't put this on you, mind. I can tell a consumptive with half an eye. See here," he appealed to us. "This is just what we suffer from. You fellows with lung trouble flock to a tapered hole like Madeira, while the Cape would cure you in half the time. Why, the voyage itself only begins to be decent after you get south. But you won't see it, and the people who do see it are just the sort who don't pay us when they come and damage us when they go back. Hard cases, sent out to pick up a living as well as their health, who get stranded and hurry home half cured." A young Briton in the deck chair next to mine rose and walked off abruptly, while I fumbled for a coin, ashamed to meet the collector's eye. "Hullo!" Mr. Olstein grinned at me. "Our friend's in a hurry to dodge the subscription list." But the young Briton turned and intercepted the collector as he moved towards the next group. "It's your sovereign," said I, "that seems to be overlooked." Mr. Olstein saw it at his elbow and repocketed it. "Well, if he hasn't the sense to pick it up, I've some more than to whistle him back. But that'll show you the sort of fool we send out to compete with Germans and such like. It's enough to make a man ashamed of his country." This happened on a Saturday morning, and in the afternoon we attended the sports, a depressing ceremony. The performers went through their contests, so to speak, with bated breath and a self-consciousness which, try as we might, poisoned our applause and made it insufferably patronizing. Their backers would pluck up heart and encourage them loudly with Whitechapel catchwords, and anon would hush their voices in uneasy shame. Our collector, brave by fits in his dignity as steward, would catch the eye of a saloon-deck passenger and shrink behind the enormous rosette which some wag had pinned upon him. Next day I made an opportunity to speak with him after service. It needed no pressing to extract his story, and he told it with entire simplicity. He was a Cockney, and by trade had been a baker in Bermondsey. "A wearing trade," he said. "The most of us die before 40. You'd be surprised." But he had started with a sound constitution, and somehow persuaded himself, in spite of warnings, that he was immune. At 32 he had married, a deal later than most, he explained, and had scarcely been married 3 months before lung trouble declared itself. "I 'ad a few pounds put by, having married so late, and it seemed a duty to Emily to give myself every chance. So we packed up almost at once and started for South Africa. It was a wrench to her, but the voyage out did us both all the good in the world, she being in a delicate state of health, and the room in Bermondsey not fit for a woman in that condition. The baby was born in Cape Town 5 months after their landing, but they've no employment for bakers out there," he assured me. "We found trade very low altogether, and what I picked up wasn't any healthier than in London. Emily disliked the place too, though she'd have stayed gladly if it had been doing me any good, and so back we're going. There's one thing, I'm safe of work. My old employer in Bermondsey has promised that all right, and the child, you see, sir, won't suffer. There's no consumption that I know of in either of our families, and Emily, you may be sure, will see he's not brought up to be a baker." He announced it in the most matter-of-fact way. He was going back to England to die speedily, and he knew it. "I should like you to see our baby, sir," he added. "He weighs extraordinary for his age. My wife comes from the north of England, a very big-boned family, and he's British, every ounce of him, though he was born in South Africa." But the wife took a chill on entering the bay, and remained below with the child. Nor was it until the day we sighted England that I saw the whole family together. We were to pick up the Eddystone, and as this was calculated to happen at sunset or a little after, the usual sweepstake on the saloon deck aroused a little more than the usual excitement. For the first glimpse, whether of lighthouse or light, would give the prize to the nearest guesser. If we anticipated sunset, the clearness of the weather would decide between the 2 pretty close shots. If we ran it fine, the lamp, which carries for 17 miles and more, might upset those who staked on daylight, even at that distance from the mark. Our guesses had been tabulated, and the paper pinned up in the smoking room. They allowed a margin of some 25 knots on the 24 hours' run, ranging, as nearly as I can recollect, from 335 to 360, and the date being the last week of March, and sunset falling close on 6:30, a whole nebula of guesses surrounded that hour, 1 or 2 divided only by a few seconds. A strong headwind met us in the channel, and the backers of daylight had almost given up hope. But it dropped in the late afternoon, and by the log we were evidently in for a close finish. Mr. Olstein had set his watch by the ship's chronometer, and consulted it from minute to minute. He stood by me, binocular in hand, and grew paler with excitement as sunset drew on, and the minutes scored off the guesses one by one from the list. His guess was among the last, but not actually the last by half a dozen. We had reached a point when 5 minutes disposed of no less than 9 guesses. The weather was dull. No one could tell precisely if the sun had sunk or not. We were certainly within 20 miles of the rock, and by the nautical almanac, unless our chronometer erred, the light ought to flash out within 60 seconds. If within 40 the man sang out from the crow's nest, Mr. Olstein would lose. After 40 he had a whole minute and a half for a clear win. The 40 seconds passed. Mr. Olstein drew a long breath of relief. "But why the devil don't they light up?" he demanded after a moment. "I call you to witness what the time is by our chronometer. I'll have it tested as soon as I step ashore, and if it's wrong I'll complain to the company. If it's not, I'll send the Trinity House a letter'll lay those lighthouse fellows by the heels. Punctuality, sir, in the case of shipping, life or death." The cry of the man in the crow's nest mingled with ours as a spark touched the northeastern horizon almost ahead of us, trembled and died, shone out as it seemed more steadily, and again was quenched. Mr. Olstein slapped his thigh. He had won something like £10 and was a joyous millionaire. "That makes twice in 4 voyages," he proclaimed. I congratulated him and strode forward. A group of third-class passengers had gathered by the starboard bow. They too had heard the cry. To all appearance they might have been an ordinary Whitechapel crowd, and even now they scarcely lifted their voices, but they whispered and pointed. The Eddystone. I singled out my friend the baker. Before I could reach him he had broken from the group. I hailed him. Without seeming to hear, he disappeared down the fore companion, but by and by he emerged again, and with a baby in his arms. Evidently he had torn it from its cot. His wife followed, weak and protesting. The child too raised a wail of querulous protest, but he hugged it to him, and running to the ship's side held it aloft. "England, baby!" It turned its head, seeking the pillow or its mother, and would not look, but broke into fresh and louder wailing. "England!" He hugged it afresh. God knows of what feeling sprang the tears that fell on its face and baptized it, but he hushed his voice, and lifting the child again, coaxed it to look, coaxed it with tears streaming now, and with a thrill that would not be denied. "England, baby! England!" End of section 20. Section 21 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. John and the Ghosts. In the kingdom of Illyria there lived not long ago a poor woodcutter with 3 sons, who in time went forth to seek their fortunes. At the end of 3 years they returned by agreement to compare their progress in the world. The eldest had become a lawyer, and the second a merchant, and each of these had won riches and friends. But John, the youngest, who had enlisted in the army, could only show a cork leg and a medal. "You have made a bad business of it," said his brothers. "Your medal is worthless except to a collector of such things, and your leg is a positive disadvantage. Fortunately we have influence, and since you are our brother, we must see what we can do for you." Now the king of Illyria lived at that time in his capital in a brick palace at the end of the great park. He kept this park open to all, and allowed no one to build in it. But the richest citizens, who were so fond of their ruler that they could not live out of his sight, had their houses just beyond the park, in the rear of the palace, on a piece of ground which they called Palace Gardens. The name was a little misleading, for the true gardens lay in front of the palace, where children of all classes played among the trees and flower beds and artificial ponds, and the king sat and watched them, because he took delight in children, and because the sight of them cheered his only daughter, who had fallen into a deep melancholy. but the rich citizens clung to it, for it gave a pleasant neighbourly air to their roadway, and showed what friendliness there was between the monarch of Illyria and his people. At either end you entered the roadway, if you were allowed, by an iron gate, and each gate had a sentry box beside it, and a tall beadle, and a notice board to save him the trouble of explanation, and the notice ran, "Private. The beadle has orders to refuse admittance to all wagons, tradesmen's carts, hackney coaches, donkeys, beggars, disorderly characters, or persons carrying burdens." A sedentary life had told so severely upon one of the two beadles that he could no longer enter his box with dignity, or read his newspaper there with any comfort. He resigned, and John obtained the post by his brother's interest, in spite of his cork leg. He had now a bright green suit with scarlet pipings, a gold laced hat, a fashionable address, and very little to do. But the army had taught him to be active, and for lack of anything better he fell into deep thinking. This came near to bringing him into trouble. One evening he looked out of his sentry box and saw a mild and somewhat sad-featured old gentleman approaching the gate. "No admittance," said John. "Tut, tut," said the old gentleman, "I'm the king." John looked at the face on his medal, and sure enough there was a resemblance. "But all the same, your majesty carries a burden." Here he pointed to the notice board, "and the folks along this road are mighty particular." The king smiled, and then sighed heavily. "It's about the princess, my daughter," said he. "She has not smiled for a whole year." "I'll warrant I'd make her," said John. "I'll warrant you could not," said the king. "She will never smile again until she is married." "Then," answered John, "speaking in a humble way as becomes me, why the dickens alive don't you marry her up and get done with it?" The king shook his head. "There's a condition attached," said he. "Maybe you've heard of the famous haunted house in Punsby Square." "I've always gone by the spelling and pronounced it Ponsonby," said John. "Well, the condition is that every suitor for my daughter's hand must spend a night alone in that house, and if he survives and is ready to persevere with his wooing, he must return a year later with his bride and spend the night of his marriage there." "And very handy," said John, "for there's a wedding cake shop at the corner." The king sighed again. "Unhappily none survive. 155 have undertaken the adventure, and not a man of them but has either lost his wits or run for it." "Well," said John, "I've been afraid of a great many men." "That's a poor confession for a soldier," put in the king, "when they all happen to come at me together. But I've never yet met a ghost that could frighten me, and if your majesty will give me the latchkey, I'll try my luck this very night." It could not be done in this free and easy way, but at 8 o'clock, after John had visited the palace and taken an oath in the princess's presence, which was his first sight of her, he was driven down to the house beside the Lord Chamberlain, who admitted him to the black front hall, and slamming the door upon him, scuttled out of the porch as quickly as possible and into his brougham. John struck a match, and as he did so he heard the carriage roll away. The walls were bare, and the floor and great staircase ahead of him carpetless. As the match flickered out, he caught a glimpse of a pair of feet moving up the stairs. That was all, only feet. "I'll catch up with the calves on the landing, maybe," said he, and striking another match he followed them up. The feet turned aside on the landing and led him into a room on the right. He paused on the threshold, drew a candle from his pocket, lit it, and stared about him. The room was of great size, bare and dusty, with crimson hangings, gilt panels, and one huge gilt chandelier, from which and from the ceiling and cornice Long cobwebs trailed down like creeping plants. Beneath the chandelier a dark smear ran along the boards. The feet crossed it towards the fireplace, and as they did so, John saw them stained with blood. They reached the fireplace and vanished. Scarcely had this happened before the end of the room opposite the window began to glow with an unearthly light. John, whose poverty had taught him to be economical, promptly blew out his candle. A moment later 2 men entered, bearing a coffin between them. They rested it upon the floor, and seating themselves upon it began to cast dice. "Your soul, my soul," they kept saying in hollow tones, according as they won or lost. At length one of them, a tall man in a powdered wig, with a face extraordinarily pale, flung a hand to his brow, rose and staggered from the room. The other sat waiting and twirling his black moustache, with an evil smile. John, who by this time had found a seat in a far corner, thought him the most poisonous-looking villain he had ever seen. But as the minutes passed and nothing happened, he turned his back to the light and pulled out a penny dreadful. His literary taste was shocking, and when it came to romance, he liked the incidents to follow one another with great rapidity. He was interrupted by a blood-curdling groan, and the first ruffian broke into the room, dragging by its grey locks the body of an old man. A young girl followed, weeping and protesting, with dishevelled hair, and behind her entered a priest with a brazier full of glowing charcoal. The girl cast herself forward on the old man's body, but the 2 scoundrels dragged her from it by force. "The money!" demanded the dark one, and she drew from her bosom a small key and cast it at his feet. "My promise!" demanded the other, and seized her by the wrist as the priest stepped forward. "Quick, over this coffin, man and wife!" She wrenched her hand away and thrust him backward. The priest retreated to the brazier and drew out a red-hot iron. John thought it about time to interfere. "I beg your pardon," said he, stepping forward, "but I suppose you really are ghosts." "We are unhallowed souls," answered the dark man impressively, "who return to blight the living with the spectacle of our awful crimes." "Meaning me?" asked John. "Aye, sir, and to destroy you tonight if you contract not upon your soul to return with your bride and meet us here a 12-month hence." Said John to himself. "They are 3 to 1, and after all it's what I came for, I suppose." He added aloud, "Some form of document is usual in these cases." The dark man drew out a pen and parchment. "Hold forth your hand," he commanded, and as John held it out, thinking he meant to shake it over the bargain, the fellow drove the pen into his wrist until the blood spurted. "Now sign." "Sign," said the other villain. "Sign," said the lady. "Oh, very well, miss, if you're in this swindle too. My mind is easier," said John, and signed his name with a flourish. "But a bargain is a bargain, and what security have I for your part in it?" "Our signature," said the priest terribly, at the same moment pressing his branding iron into John's ankle. A smell of burnt cork arose as John stooped and clapped his hand over the scorched stocking. When he looked up again his visitors had vanished, and a moment later the strange light too died away. But the coffin remained for evidence that he had not been dreaming. John lit a candle and examined it. "Just the thing for me," he exclaimed, finding it to be a mere shell of pine boards, loosely nailed together and painted black. I was beginning to shiver. He knocked the coffin to pieces, crammed them into the fireplace, and very soon had a grand fire blazing, before which he sat and finished his penny dreadful, and so dropped off into a sound sleep. The Lord Chamberlain arrived early in the morning, and finding him stretched there, at first broke into lamentations over the fate of yet another personable young man, but soon changed his tune when John sat up, and, rubbing his eyes, demanded to be told the time. "But are you really alive? We must drive back and tell his Majesty at once." "Stay a moment," said John. "There is a brother of mine, a lawyer, in the city. He'll be arriving at his office about this time, and you must drive me there, for I have a document here of a sort, and must have it stamped to be on the safe side." So into the city he was driven beside the Lord Chamberlain, and there had his leg stamped and filed for reference, and having purchased another, was conveyed to the palace, where the king received him with open arms. He was now a favoured guest at the court, and had frequent opportunities of seeing and conversing with the princess, with whom he soon fell deeply in love. But as the months passed, and the time drew near for their marriage, he grew silent and thoughtful, for he feared to expose her, even in his company, to the sights he had witnessed in the haunted house. He thought and thought, until one fine afternoon he snapped his fingers suddenly, and after that went about whistling. A fortnight before the day fixed for the wedding, he drove into the city again, but this time to the office of his other brother, the merchant. "I want," he said, "a loan of £1,000. "Nothing easier," said his brother. "Here are 850. Of the remainder I shall keep 50 as interest for the first year, at 5%. And the odd 100 should purchase a premium of insurance for £2,000, which I will retain as security against accidents." This seemed not only fair, but brotherly. John pocketed his £850, shook his creditor affectionately by the hand, and hurried westward. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp, and in the evening the king, who had been shedding tears at intervals throughout the ceremonies, accompanied his daughter to the haunted house. The princess was pale. John, on the contrary, who sat facing her father in the state coach, smiled with a cheerfulness which, under the circumstances, seemed a trifle ill-bred. The wedding guests followed in 24 chariots. Their cards of invitation had said 2 to 5:30 p.m., and it was now 8 o'clock, but they could not resist the temptation to see the last of the poor dear thing, as they agreed to call the bride. The king sat silent during the drive. He was preparing his farewell speech, which he meant to deliver on the porch, but arriving and perceiving a crowd about it, and also, to his vast astonishment, a red baize carpet on the perron, and a butler bowing in the doorway with 2 footmen behind him, he coughed down his exordium and led his daughter into the hall amid showers of rice and confetti. The bridegroom followed, and so did the wedding guests, since no one opposed them. The hall and staircase were decorated with palms and pot plants, flags and emblems of Illyria, and in the great drawing-room which they entered, while John persuaded the king to a seat, they found many rows of morocco-covered chairs, a miniature stage with a drop representing the play scene in Hamlet, a row of footlights, a boudoir grand piano, and a man seated at the keyboard whom they recognized as a performer in much demand at suburban dances. The company had scarcely seated itself before a strange light began to illuminate the end of the room at which the stage stood, and immediately the curtain rose to the overture of M. Offenbach's Orphée aux Enfers, the pianist continuing with great spirit until a round of applause greeted the entrance of the 2 spectral performers. Its effect upon them was in the highest degree disconcerting. They sat down the coffin, and after a brief and hurried conference in an undertone, the black mustachioed ghost advanced to the footlights, singled out John from the audience, and with a terrific scowl demanded to know the reason of this extraordinary gathering. "Come, come, my dear sir," answered John. "Our contract, if you will study it, allows me to invite whom I choose. It merely insists that my bride and I must be present. As you see, we are. Pray go on with your part, and assure yourself it is no use trying the high horse with me." The dark ghost looked at his partner, who shuffled uneasily. "I told you," said he, "we should have trouble with this fellow. I had a presentiment of it when he came to spend the night here without bringing a bulldog. That frightening of the bulldog out of his wits has always been our most effective bit of business." Hereupon the dark ghost took another tone. "Our fair but unfortunate victim has a sore throat to-night," he announced. "The performance is consequently postponed," and he seated himself sulkily upon the coffin, when the limelight man from the wings promptly bathed him in a flood of the most beautiful rose colour. "Oh, this is intolerable!" he exclaimed, starting to his feet. "It is not first rate, I agree," said John, "but such as it is, we had better get through with it. Should the company doubt its genuineness, I can go around afterwards and show the brand on the cork." Here he tapped the leg which he had been careful to bring with him. Before this evidence of contract, the ghost's resistance collapsed. They seated themselves on the coffin and began the casting of dice. The performance proceeded, but in a half-hearted and perfunctory manner, notwithstanding the vivacious efforts of the limelight man. The tall ghost struck his brow and fled from the stage. There were cries of "Call him back!" but John explained that this was part of the drama and no encores would be allowed, whereupon the audience fell to hissing the villain, who now sat alone with the most lifelike expression of malignity. "Oh, hang it!" he expostulated after a while. "I am doing this under protest, and you need not make it worse for a fellow. I draw the line at hissing." "It's the usual thing," explained John affably. But when the ghostly lady walked on, and in the act of falling on her father's body was interrupted by the pianist, who handed up an immense bouquet, the performers held another hurried colloquy. "Look here," said the dark-browed villain, stepping forward and addressing John, "what will you take to call it quits?" "I'll take," said John, "the key which the lady has just handed you, and if the treasure is at all commensurate with the fuss you've been making about it, we'll let bygones be bygones." Well, it did, and John, having counted it out behind the curtain, came forward and asked the pianist to play "God Save the King," and so, having bowed his guest to the door, took possession of the haunted house, and lived in it many years with his bride, in high renown and prosperity. End of section 21.
Section 22 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Section 22. 3 photographs. Photograph all the prisoners? But why? Demanded Sir Felix Williams. Old Canon Kemp shrugged his shoulders. Admiral Truebody turned the pages of the Home Secretary's letter. They sat at the baize-covered table in the magistrates' room, the last of the visiting justices who met under the old regime to receive the Governor's report and look after the welfare of the prisoners in Tregarrick County Gaol. But why, in the name of common sense? Sir Felix persisted. I suppose, hazarded the Admiral, it helps the police in identifying criminals. But the letter says all the prisoners. You don't seriously tell me that anyone wants a photograph to identify poacher Trusise, whom I've committed a score of times if I've committed him once. And perhaps you'll explain to me this further demand for a composite photograph of all the prisoners, male and female. A composite photograph. Have you ever seen one? No, the Admiral mused, but I see what the Home Office is driving at. Someone has been persuading them to test these new theories in criminology the doctors are so busy with. especially in Italy. In Italy? Psst, Sir Felix Williams. My dear Sir Felix, science has no nationality. The Admiral was a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and kept a microscope to amuse his leisure. It has some proper limits, I should hope, Sir Felix retorted. It annoyed him, a chairman of Quarter Sessions for close upon 20 years, to be told that the science of criminology was yet in its infancy, and he glanced mischievously at the Canon, who might be supposed to have a professional quarrel with scientific men. But the Canon was a wary fighter, and no waster of powder and shot. "Well, well," said he, "I don't see what harm it can do, or what good. If the Home Secretary wants his composite photograph, let him have it. The only question is, have we a photographer who knows how to make one? Let him have it. The only question is, have we a photographer who knows how to make one? Or must we send the negatives up to Whitehall?" So the visiting justices sent for the local photographer and consulted him, and he, being a clever fellow, declared it was easy enough, a mere question of care in superimposing the negatives. He had never actually made the experiment, his clients, so he called his customers, preferring to be photographed singly, or in family groups, but he asked to be given a trial, and suggested, to be on the safe side, preparing 2 or 3 of these composite prints, between which the justices might choose at their next meeting. This was resolved, and the resolution entered in the minutes, and next day the photographer set to work. Some of the prisoners resisted and "made faces" in front of the camera, squinting and pulling the most horrible mouths. A female shoplifter sat under protest because she was not allowed to send home for an evening gown. But the most consented obediently, and Jim Tresize even asked for a copy to take home to his wife. The Admiral, who had married late in life, resided with his wife and young family in a neat villa just outside the town, where his hobby was to grow pelargoniums. The photographer passed the gate daily on his way to and from the prison, and was usually hailed and catechised on his progress. His patience with the recalcitrant prisoners delighted the Admiral, who more than once assured his wife that Smithers was an intelligent fellow and quite an artist in his way. "I wonder how he manages it," said Mrs. Trewbody. "He told baby last autumn that a little bird would fly out of the camera when he took off the cap, and everyone allows that the result is most lifelike. But I don't like the idea, and I think it may injure his trade." The Admiral could not always follow his wife's reasoning. "What is it you dislike?" he asked. "Well, it's not nice to think of oneself going into the same camera he's been using on those wretched prisoners. It's sentiment, I daresay, but I had the same feeling when he stuck up Harry's photograph in his showcase at the railway station among all kinds of objectionable persons, and I requested him to remove it." The Admiral laughed indulgently, being one of those men who find a charm, even a subtle flattery, in their wife's silliness. "I agree with you," he said, "that it's not pleasant to be exposed to public gaze among a crowd of people one would never think of knowing. I don't suppose it would actually encourage familiarity. At the same time, there's an air of promiscuity about it, I won't say disrespect, which jars. But with the prisoners it's different. My attitude to them is scientific, if I may say so. I look upon them as a race apart, almost of another world, and as such I find them extremely interesting. The possibility of mixing with them on any terms of intimacy doesn't occur. I'm aware, my dear," he wound up graciously, "that you women seldom understand this mental detachment, being by nature unscientific, and all the more charming for your prejudices." At the next meeting of justices, Smithers the photographer presented himself, and produced his prints with a curious air of diffidence. "I have," he explained, "brought 3 for your worship's selection, and can honestly assure your worships that my pains have been endless. What puzzles me, however, is that although in all 3 the same portraits have been imposed, and in the same order, the results are surprisingly different. The cause of these differences I cannot detect, though I have gone over the process several times and step by step. But out of some 2 dozen experiments, I may say that all the results answer pretty closely to one or another of these three types." Mr. Smithers, who had spent much time in rehearsing this little speech, handed up photograph number 1, and Sir Felix adjusted his spectacles. "Villainous!" he exclaimed, recoiling. The Canon and the Admiral bent over it together. "Most repulsive," said the Admiral. "Here indeed," the Canon was more impressive. "Here indeed is an object lesson in the effects of crime. Is it possible that to this man's passions can degrade his divinely inherited features? Were it not altogether too horrible, I would have this picture framed and glazed and hung up in every cottage home in the land." "My dear fellow," interrupted Sir Felix, "we cannot possibly let this monstrosity go up to Whitehall as representative of the inmates of Tregarrick Gaol. It would mean an inquiry on the spot. It would even reflect upon us. Ours is a decent county as counties go, and I protest it shall not, with my consent, be injured by any such libel." Mr. Smithers handed up photograph number 2. "This looks better," began Sir Felix, and with that he gave a slight start, and passed the photograph to the Canon. The Canon, too, started, and stole a quick glance at Sir Felix. Their eyes met. "It certainly is singular," stammered Sir Felix. "I fancied, without a reference but you detected it too?" he wound up incoherently. "May I have a look?" The Admiral peered over the Canon's hand, who, however, did not relinquish the photograph, but turned on Smithers with sudden severity. "I presume, sir, this is not an audacious joke?" "I assure your worship," protested the photographer, "I had some thoughts of tearing it up, but thought it wouldn't be honest." "You did rightly," the Canon answered, "but now that we have seen it, I have no such scruple." He tore the print across and across again. "Even in this," he said, with a glance at the Admiral, who winced, "we may perhaps read a lesson, or at least a warning, that man's presumption in extending the bounds of his knowledge, or as I should prefer to call it, his curiosity, may bring him face to face with—" But the Canon's speech tailed off as he regarded the torn pieces of cardboard in his hand. He felt that the others had been seriously perturbed and were not listening. He himself was conscious of a shock too serious for that glib emollient usually so efficacious, the sound of his own voice. He perceived that it did not impose even on the photographer. An uncomfortable silence fell on the room. Sir Felix was the first to recover. "Put it in the waste paper basket. No, in the fire," he commanded, and turned to Smithers. "Surely between these two extremes—" "I was on the point of suggesting that your worships would find number 3 more satisfactory," the photographer interrupted, forgetting his manners in his anxiety to restore these three gentlemen to their ease. His own discomfort was acute, and he overacted, as a man will who has unwittingly surprised a state secret and wishes to assure everyone of his obtuseness. Sir Felix studied number 3. "This appears to me a very ordinary photograph. Without being positively displeasing, the face is one you might pass in the street any day and forget." "I hope it suggests no well-known features," put in the Canon nervously. "None at all, I think. But see for yourself. To me it seems, although hazy of course, the kind of thing the Home Office might find helpful." "It is less distinct than the others." The Admiral pulled his whiskers. "And for that reason the more obviously composite, which is what we are required to furnish. No, indeed, I can find nothing amiss with it, and I think, gentlemen, if you are agreed, we will forward this print." Number 3 was passed accordingly. The photographer withdrew, and the three justices turned to other business, which occupied them for a full 2 hours. But I pray you, mark the sequel. Mr. Smithers, in his relief and delight at the magistrate's approbation, hurried home, fished out a copy of number 3, exposed it proudly in his shop window, and went off to the Packhorse Inn for a drink. Less than an hour later, Mrs. Trewbody, having packed her family into the jingle for their afternoon's ride with Miss Platt, the governess, strolled down into the town to do some light shopping, and, happening to pass the photographer's window, came to a standstill with a little gasp. A moment later she entered the shop, and Mrs. Smithers, answering the shop bell, found that she had taken the photograph from the window and was examining it eagerly. "This is quite a surprise, Mrs. Smithers. A capital photograph. May I ask how many copies my husband ordered?" I'm not aware, ma'am, that the Admiral has ordered any as yet, though I heard Smithers say only this morning as he hoped he'd be pleased with it. I think I can answer for that, although he is particular, but I happen to know he disapproves of these things being exposed in the window. I'll take this copy home with me, if I may. Has your husband printed any more? Well, no, ma'am. There was one other copy, but Lady Felix Williams happened to be passing just now and spied it, and nothing would do but she must take it away with her. Lady Felix Williams? Mrs. Trewbody stiffened with sudden distrust. Now what would Lady Felix Williams want with this? I'm sure I can't tell you, ma'am, but she was delighted. A capital likeness, she said. I've never seen a photograph before that caught just that expression of his. I should very much like to know what she has to do with his expression, Mrs. Trewbody murmured to herself, between wonder and incipient alarm. But she concealed her feelings, good lady, and having paid for her purchase, carried it home in her muff, and stuck it upright against one of the Sèvres candlesticks on her boudoir mantel-shelf. And there the Admiral discovered it 3/4 of an hour later. He came home wanting his tea, and finding the boudoir empty, advanced to ring the bell. At that moment his eyes fell on Smithers' replica of the very photograph he had passed for furtherance to the Home Secretary. He picked it up and gave vent to a long whistle. Now how the dickens— His wife appeared in the doorway, with Harry, Dicky, and Theophila clinging to her skirts, fresh from their ride and boisterous. My dear Emily, where in the world did you get hold of this? He held the photograph towards her at arm's length, and the children rushed forward to examine it. Papa! Papa! They shouted together, capering around it. Oh, Mammy, isn't it him exactly? End of section 22. Section 23 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Section 23. The Talking Ships. He was a happy boy, for he lived beside a harbour, and just below the last bend where the river swept out of the steep woodlands into view of the sea. A half-ruined castle, with a battery of antiquated guns, still made believe to protect the entrance to the harbour, and looked across it upon a ridge of rocks surmounted by a wooden cross, which the Trinity pilots kept in repair. Between the cross and the fort, for as long as he could remember, a procession of ships had come sailing in to anchor by the great red buoy immediately beneath his nursery window. They belonged to all nations, and hailed from all imaginable ports, and from the day his nurse had first stood him upon a chair to watch them, these had been the great interest of his life. He soon came to know them all, French brigs and chasse-marées, Russian fore and afters, Dutch billy boys, galliots from the east coast, and Thames hay barges with vanes and windboards. He could tell you why the Italians were deep in the keel, why the Danes were manned by youngsters, and why these youngsters deserted, although their skippers looked, and indeed were, such good-natured fellows. What food the French crews hunted in the seaweed under the cliff, and when the Baltic traders would be driven southward by the ice. Once acquainted with a vessel, he would recognise her at any distance, though by what signs he could no more tell than we why we recognise a friend. On his 7th birthday he was given a sailing boat, on condition that he learned to read. But although he kept by the bargain honestly, at the end of a month he handled her better than he was likely to handle his book in a year. He had a companion and instructor, of course, a pensioner who had left the navy to become in turn fisherman, yachtsman, able seaman on board a dozen sailing vessels, and now yachtsman again. His name was Billy, and he taught the boy many mysteries, from the tying of knots to the reading of weather signs, how to beach a boat, how to take a conger off the hook, how to gaff a cuttle and avoid its ink. In return the boy gave him his heart, and even something like worship. One fine day, as they tacked to and fro a mile and more from the harbour's mouth, whiffing for mackerel, the boy looked up from his seat by the tiller. "I say, Billy, did you speak?" Billy, seated on the thwart and leaning with both arms on the weather gunwale, turned his head lazily. "Not a word this half hour," he answered. "Well now, I thought not, but somebody or something spoke just now." The boy blushed, for Billy was looking at him quizzically. "It's not the first time I've heard it either," he went on. "Sometimes it sounds right astern, and sometimes close beside me." "What does it say?" asked Billy, relighting his pipe. "I don't know that it says anything, and yet it seems to speak out quite clearly. 5 or 6 times I've heard it, and usually on smooth days like this, when the wind's steady." Billy nodded. "That's right, sonny. I've heard it scores of times, and they say—but there, I don't believe a word of it." "What do they say?" "They say that 'tis the voice of drowned men down below, and that they hail their names whenever a boat passes." The boy stared at the water. He knew it for a floor through which he let down his trammels and crab pots into Wonderland, a twilight with forests and meadows of its own, in which all the marvels of all the fairy books were possible. But the terror of it had never clouded his delight. "Nonsense, Billy! The voice I hear is always quite cheerful and friendly, not a bit like a dead man's." "I tell what I'm told," answered Billy, and the subject dropped. But the boy did not cease thinking about the voice, and some time after he came, as it seemed, upon a clue. His father had set him to read Shakespeare, and taking down the first of 12 volumes from the shelf, he began upon the first play, The Tempest. He was prepared to yawn, but the first scene flung open a door to him, and he stepped into a new world, a childish Ferdinand roaming an Isle of Voices. He resigned Miranda to the grown-up prince, for whom, as he saw at a glance, being wise in the ways of storybooks, she was eminently fitted. It was in Ariel, perched with harp upon the shrouds of the king's ship, that he recognised the unseen familiar of his own voyaging. "O spirit, be my friend, speak to me often." As children will, he gave Prospero's island a local habitation in the tangled cliff garden, tethered Caliban in the tool shed, and watched the white surf far withdrawn, or listened to its murmur between the lordly boles of the red-currant bushes. For the first time he became aware of some limitations in Billy. He had long been aware of some serious limitations in his nurse. She could not, for instance, sail a boat, and her only knot was a granny. He never dreamed of despising her, being an affectionate boy, but more and more he went his own way without consulting her. Yet it was she who, unconsciously and quite as if it were nothing out of the way, handed him the clue. A flagstaff stood in the garden on a grassy platform, halfway down the cliffside, and the boy, at his earnest wish, had been given charge of it. On weekdays, as a rule, he hoisted 2 flags, an ensign on the gaff and a single code flag at the masthead. But on Sundays he usually ran up 3 or 4, and with the help of the code book spelt out some message to the harbour. Sometimes, too, if an old friend happened to take up her moorings at the Red Buoy below, he would have her code letters hoisted to welcome her, or would greet and speed her with such signals as KTN, glad to see you, and BRD, or BQR, meaning goodbye. A pleasant passage. Skippers fell into the habit of dipping their flags to him as they were towed out to sea, and a few amused themselves while at anchor by pulling out their bags of bunting and signalling humorous conversations, though their topmasts reached so near to the boy's platform that they might with less labour have talked through a speaking trumpet. One morning before Christmas, 6 vessels lay below at the buoy, moored stern to stern in 2 tiers of 3, and after hoisting his signal CPBH for Christmas Eve, he ran indoors with the news that all 6 were answering with bushes of holly at their topmast heads, while one, a Danish barquentine, had rove stronger halyards and carried a tall fir tree at the main, its branches reaching many feet above her truck. "Christmas is Christmas," said his nurse, When I was young, at such times there wouldn't be a ship in the harbour without its talking bush." "What is a talking bush?" the boy asked. "And you pretend to be a sailor? Well, well, not to know what happens on Christmas night when the clocks strike 12." The boy's eyes grew round. "Do the ships talk?" "Why, of course they do. For my part, I wonder what Billy teaches you." Late that evening, when the household supposed him to be in bed, the boy crept down through the moonlit garden to the dinghy which Billy had left on its frape under the cliff. But for their riding lights, the vessels at the buoy lay asleep. The crews of the foreigners had turned in. The Nubian, of Runcorn, had no soul on board but a night watchman, now soundly dozing in the forecastle, and the Touch-me-not was deserted. The Touch-me-not belonged to the port, and her skipper, Captain Tanguy, looked after her in harbour when he had paid off all hands. Usually he slept on board, but tonight, after trimming his lamp, he had rowed ashore to spend Christmas with his family, for which, since he owned a majority of the shares, no one was likely to blame him. He had even left the accommodation ladder hanging over her side, to be ready for boarding her in the morning. All this the boy had noted, and accordingly, having pushed across in the dinghy, he climbed the Touch-me-not's ladder and dropped upon deck with a bundle of rugs and his father's greatcoat under his arm. He looked about him and listened. There was no sound at all but the lap of tide between the ships, and the voice of a preacher travelling over the water from a shed far down the harbour, where the Salvation Army was holding a midnight service. Captain Tanguy had snugged down his ship for the night. Ropes were coiled, deck-houses padlocked, the spokes of the wheel covered against dew and frost. The boy found the slack of a stout hawser coiled beneath the taffrail, a circular fort into which he crept with his rugs and nestled down warmly, and then for half an hour lay listening. But only the preacher's voice broke the silence of the harbour. On it went, rising and falling. Away in the little town the church clock chimed the quarter. "It must have missed striking the hour," thought the boy, and he peered over the edge of his shelter. The preacher's voice had ceased, but another was speaking, and close beside him. "You'd be surprised," it said, "how simple one's pleasures grow with age. This is the 12th Christmas I've spent at home, and I assure you I quite look forward to it. That's a confession, eh? From one who has sailed under Nelson and smelt powder in his time." The boy knew that he must be listening to the Touch-me-not, whose keelson came from an old line of battleship. "To be sure," the voice went on graciously, "a great deal depends on one's company." "Talking of powder," said the Nubian, creaking gently on her stern moorings, "reminds me of a terrible adventure. My very first voyage was to the mouth of a river on the west coast of Africa, where two native tribes were at war. Somehow my owner, a scoundrelly fellow in the Midlands, had wind of the quarrel, and that the tribe nearest the coast needed gunpowder. We sailed from Cardiff with 1,500 barrels duly labelled, and the natives came out to meet us at the river mouth and rafted them ashore. But the barrels, if you will believe me, held nothing but sifted coal dust. Off we went before the trick was discovered, and with £6,000 worth of ivory in my hold. But the worst villainy was to come, for my owner, pretending that he had opened up a profitable trade, and having his ivory to show for it, sold me to a London firm, who loaded me with real gunpowder and sent me out 6 months later to the same river, but with a new skipper and a different crew. The natives knew me at once, and came swarming out in canoes as soon as we dropped anchor. The captain, who of course suspected nothing, allowed them to crowd on board, and I declare that within 5 minutes they had clubbed him and every man of the crew, and tossed their bodies to the sharks. Then they cut my hawsers and towed me over the river bar, and having landed a good half of my barrels, they built and lit a fire around them in derision. I can hear the explosions still. My poor upper works have been crazy ever since. It destroyed almost all the fighters of the tribe, who had formed a ring to dance around the fire. The rest fled inland, and I never saw them again, but lay abandoned for months as they had anchored me, between the ruined huts and a sandy pit alive with mosquitoes, until somehow a British tramp steamer heard of me at one of the trading stations up the coast. She brought down a crew to man and work me home, but my owner could not pay the salvage, so the parties who owned the steamer, a Runcorn firm, paid him £50 and kept me for their services. A surveyor examined me and reported that I should never be fit for much. The explosion had shaken me to pieces. I might do for the coasting trade, that was all, and in that I have remained. "Owners are rogues for the most part," commented the Danish barkentine, rubbing against the touch-me-not's fender, as if to nudge her. "There's the Maria Stella Maris yonder, who can tell us a tale of the food they store us with. She went through a mutiny once, I've heard." "I'd rather not talk of it," put in the Italian hastily, and a shudder ran through her timbers. "It's a dreadful recollection, and I have that by my mizzenmast which all the holystone in the world can never scour." "But I've had a mutiny too," said the Dutch galliot, with a voice of great importance, and this time the boy felt sure that the vessels nudged one another. "It happened," the galliot went on, "between my skipper and his vrouw, who was to all purpose our mate, and as good a mate as ever I sailed with, but she would not believe the world was round. The skipper took a Dutch cheese and tried to explain things. He moved the cheese round, as it might be, from west to east, and argued, until at last, being a persevering man, he did really persuade her, but it took a whole voyage, and by the time he succeeded we were near home again, and in the North Sea Canal. The moment she was convinced, what must the woman do but go ashore to an aunt of hers who lived at Zaandam, and refuse to return on board, though her man went on his bended knees to her. 'I will not,' she said, 'and that's flat, at any rate.' The poor man had to start afresh, undo every one of his arguments, and prove the earth flat again, before she would trust herself to travel. It cost us a week, but for my part I didn't grudge it. Your cliffs and deep water harbours don't appeal to me. Give me a canal with windmills and summer houses, where you can look in on the families drinking tea as you sail by. Give me, above all, a canal on Sundays, when the folks walk along the towing path in their best clothes, and you feel as if you were going to church with them." "Give me, rather," said the Norwegian bark from Christiansund, "a fjord with forests running straight up to the snow mountains, and water so deep that no ship's anchor can reach it." "I have seen most waters," the Dane announced calmly and proudly. "As you see, I am very particular about my paint, for a ship ought to keep up her beauty and look as young as she can. But I have an ice mark around my breast, which is usually taken for a proof of experience, and as a philosopher I say that all waters are tolerable enough if one carries the talisman." "But can a ship be beautiful? And what is the talisman?" asked the Italian and the Nubian together. "One at a time, please. My dear," she addressed the Italian, "the point is that men whom we serve think us beautiful indeed. It seems strange to us who carry the thought of the forests we have left, and on warm days, when the sap awakes in us and tries to climb again, forgetting its weakness, we miss the green boughs and the moss at our feet and the birds overhead. But I have studied my reflection often enough in calm weather, and begin to see what men have in mind when they admire us." "And the talisman?" asked the Nubian again. "The talisman? There is no one cure for useless regret, but each must choose his own. With me it is the thought of the child after whom I was christened. The day they launched me was her first birthday, and she, a small thing, held in the crook of her mother's arm. When the bottle swung against my stern, the wine spurted, and some drops of it fell on her face. The mother did not see me take the water. She was too busy wiping the drops away. But it was a successful launch, and I have brought the family luck, while she has brought them happiness. Because of it, and because our names are alike, her parents think of us together, and sometimes when one begins to talk of Thekla, the other will not know for a moment which of us is meant. They drink my health too, on her birthday, which is the 14th of May, and you know King Solomon's verse for the 14th. She is like the merchant's ships, she bringeth her food from afar. That is what I have done while she was growing, for King Solomon wrote it for a wife, of course. But now I shall yield up my trust, for when I return she is to be married. She shall bind that verse upon her with a coral necklace I carry for my gift, and it shall dance on her white throat when her husband leads her out to open the wedding ball." "Since you are so fond of children," said the Touch-me-not, "tell me, what shall we do for the one I have on my deck? He is the small boy who signals Christmas to us from the garden above, and he dreams of nothing but the sea, though his parents wish him to stick to his books and go to college." The Dane did not answer for a moment. She was considering. "Wherever he goes," she said at length, "and whatever he does, he will find that to serve much is to renounce much. Let us show him that what is renounced may yet come back in beautiful thoughts." And it seemed to the boy that as she ceased, a star dropped out of the sky and poised itself above the fir tree on her maintopmast, and that the bare mast beneath it put forth branches, while upon every branch, as it spread, a globe of fire dropped from the star, until a gigantic Christmas tree soared from the deck away up to heaven. In the blaze of it the boy saw the miracle run from ship to ship, the timber bursting into leaf with the song of birds and the scent of tropical plants. Across the avenue of teak which had been the Nubian's bulwarks, he saw the Dutchman's galley, now a summer house set in parterres of tulips. Beyond it the sails of the Maria Stella Maris, shaken from the yards, were piling themselves into snowy mountains, their foot ropes and braces trailing down and breaking into leaves and clusters of the vine. He heard the murmur of streams flowing, the hum of bees, the whetting of the scythes, even the stir of insects' wings among the grasses. From truck to keelson the ships were wavering, dissolving part from part into remote but unforgotten hiding places, whence the mastering adventurer had torn them to bind and yoke them in service. Divine the service, but immortal also the longing to return. But there the glorious Lord will be unto us a place of broad rivers and streams, wherein shall go no galley with oars, neither shall gallant ship pass thereby. The boy heard the words, but before he understood them, a hand was on his shoulder, and another voice speaking above him. "God bless us, it's you, is it? Here's a nice tale to tell your father, I must say." He opened his eyes, and above Captain Tangi's shoulder the branches faded, the lights died out, and the masts stood stripped and bare for service against the cold dawn. End of section 23.
Section 24 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kyle Donnellan. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. The Keepers of the Lamp. It was in a purple twilight of May that I first saw the lamp shining. For me, a child of 7, the voyage had been a tiring one. It seemed many hours since, with a ringing of bells, and hearts adventurously throbbing with the screw of our small steamboat, we had backed and swung, casting our wash in waves along the quay walls. And so, after a pause during which we held our breath and drifted from the line of watching faces, had headed away for the great empty skyline beyond which the islands lay. I knew that they lay yonder, for the evening before my father had led me up a tall hill and pointed them out to me, black specks in the red ball of the sun. But today, as hour after hour went by with the pant of the engines, the lift and slide of the Atlantic swell, the tonic wind humming against the stays, my eyes grew heavy, and at length my head dropped against my father's shoulder. And then, to me it seemed the next instant, he woke me up and pointed towards the islands as they rose out of the indigo sea. At first they looked rather like low-lying clouds, but after a minute or two there was no mistaking them, for, as if they had just discovered us. They hung out lamp after lamp, some steady, some intermittent, but all of them gleaming yellow along the floor of the sea, save one, a crimson light which hid and showed itself again northward of the rest. Crimson was my favorite color in those days, and even as I dropped back into sleep, I decided that I liked this lamp the best of all. I awoke again to the sound of voices. We were passing a pilot boat out there on the watch for ships. Her crew hailed us as we went by, and I saw their faces in the green radiance of our starboard light. Gaunt, dark faces, altogether foreign. One of the men, the oldest, was bareheaded, with long gray locks, and wore a yellow neckcloth with his shirt open below it, and his naked chest showing. Their voices as they answered our skipper were clear and gay, like the voices of children. And, next, we were along a quay. Our seats, our bulwarks, even our decks shone with dew. A crowd stood on the dim quay edge and looked down on us, and chattered, but in soft voices. There was a policeman, too, and I wondered how he came there. Above this shadowy, moving crowd rode the stars I had known at home. I took my father's hand. At the head of the gangway he stooped, hoisted me on his shoulders, and carried me up and up through narrow, mysterious streets, around dark corners, past belated islanders hurrying down to the steamer, but always upward, until he pushed open a door and set me down blinking in a whitewashed bedroom lit by a couple of candles, and with that came sleep. Happy days followed, blue and white days, days vaulted and floored with blue, flashing with white granite, with the rush of white water beneath the shadow of the leaning sail, with white cirrus clouds, with white wings of seabirds. It was the height of the nesting season, and the birds had brought us to the islands, my father with paint-box and camera. Though, our time being short, he relied almost wholly on the latter. A naturalist, and by temper the gentlest of men, in his methods he was a born pioneer. You can hardly imagine how cumbrous and well-nigh hopeless a business it was in those days, not so long past, to pursue after wildlife with a camera. But 1,000 disheartening failures left him still grasping the inviolable shade, still confident that in photography, if it could only be given with rapidity and precision, lay the naturalist's hope. Blurred negatives were all the spoil, and sorry enough, we bore back after long days of tossing and climbing among the outer islands. But we had the reward of living among the birds. They filled our thoughts, our lives for the time. Great cormorants and northern divers, flitting red-legged oyster-catchers, shags spreading their wings to the wind and sun, sea parrots, murres, razor-bills, gannets questing by ones and twos, now poised, now dropping like plummets with a resounding splash, sandpipers and curlews dotting the beaches and waiting, tern, common gulls, herring gulls, and kittiwakes, and, at nightfall, shearwaters popping from their holes and swimming and skimming around our boat as we headed for home. And then the nests we discovered. Nay, the nests that at all times we walked among, picking our steps like egg dancers. Nests boldly planted on the bare rock ledges, nests snugly hidden among the clusters of blue thrift and the massed sea pinks. They bloomed everywhere, these sea pinks, sheet upon sheet of pale rose color, soon to show paler and fade before the rosy splendors of the mesembryanthemum. But the thrift had no rival to fear, condensing blue heaven and blue sea in the flower it lifted against both, and to lie prone and make a frame of it, for some winding channel when the tide rip flashed, and toss was to send the eye plunging into blue like an eastern diver after pearls. But when after sunset the blue deepened to violet, always in the heart of it glowed the crimson light upon Off Island. Night after night I watched it from my window, and wondered what manner of people they were who tended it, living out yonder on a rock where no grass grew, and in a roar of tide which the inhabitants of the greater islands heard on still days in the few inland valleys where it was possible to lose sight of the sea. I knew that thousands of puffins bred there, and we were to visit the rock some day. But, what with the tides and an all but ceaseless groundswell, our opportunity was long in coming, and old Seth, our boatman, kept putting it off until I began to disbelieve in it altogether. It came, though, at last, with a cloudless morning and a northeasterly breeze, brisk and steady, the clearest day in a fortnight of clear days. We were heading northward, close-hauled through a sound dividing two of the greater islands. Old Seth at the tiller, my father tending the sheet, and I perched on the weather gunwale, and peering over and down on the purple reefs we seemed to avoid so narrowly, when Seth lifted his voice in a shout, and then, with a word of warning, paid out sheet, brought the boat's nose round, and ran her in towards a silver-white beach on our left. As we downed sail, I saw a girl on the bank above the beach, leaning on a hoe, and gazing at us over a low hedge of veronica. Seth hailed her again, and she came running to the waterside. There she stood and eyed us shyly. A dark-haired girl, bareheaded, and with the dust of the potato patch on her shoes and ankles. "Any message for Rube Hicks, my dear? We'm bound over to Off Island." She hesitated, looking from Seth to us, and while she hesitated, a flush mounted to her tanned face and deepened there. "Come," old Seth coaxed her. "You needn't be afeard to trust us with your little secrets." She seemed, at all events, to have made up her mind to trust us. From the pocket of her skirt she drew a tattered, paper-covered book, opened it, and was about to tear out a couple pages, but paused. "I'd like to send it," said she, but still paused, and at length passed the open book to Seth. "I see," he nodded. "Seems a pity, don't it, to tear up good printed stuff? Tell you what," he suggested. "You leave me take the book over as 'tis, and this evening, if you'll be waiting here, I'll bring it back safe." She brightened at once. "That'll do brave. Tellin' I hope he's keepin' well, and give my love to the others." "Right you are," promised Seth cheerfully, pushing off. "And don't you forget," she called after us. Seth laughed. "That's a very good girl now," he commented as he settled himself to the tiller again. "Must be a poor job courtin' with a lighthouse man. Not much walking together for they. No harm, I suppose. And you're seem the maid's book." He handed it to my father, who shook his head. "Aw," went on Seth, guessing why he hesitated. "There's no writing in it. Only print." He held the book open. It was a nautical almanac, and night by night the girl had penciled out the hour of sunset. Night by night the first flash of the off-island lamp carried her lover's message to her, and, as Seth explained, but it needed no explanation, at that signal she blotted out yet one more of the days between her and the marriage day. Off Island rose from the sea a sheer mass of granite, about 150 feet in height, and all but inaccessible had it not been for a rock stairway hewn out by the brethren of the Trinity House. The keepers had spied our boat, and a tall young man stood on one of the lower steps to welcome us. Not Reuben, but Reuben's younger brother Sam. Reuben met us at the top of the staircase, where the puffins built so thickly that a false step would almost certainly send the foot crashing through the roof of one of their oddly shaped houses. He, too, was a tall youth, an inch or two taller, maybe, than his brother, whom we had left in charge of the boat. It would have puzzled you to guess their ages. Young they surely were, but much gazing in their face of the salt wind had creased the corners of their eyes, and their faces wore a beautiful gravity, as though they had been captured young and dedicated to some priestly service. Reuben touched his cap, and taking the book from Seth without a word, led us to the cottage where his mother stood scoring a deal table. A little woman with dark eyes like beads, and thin gray hair tucked within a gray muslin cap. She had kilted her gown high and tucked up her sleeves, and looked to me, for all the world, like a doll on a pen wiper. But her hands were busy continually. The small room shone and gleamed with her tireless cleansing and polishing, and in the midst of it her eyes sparkled with the expectation of news from the outer world. Seth understood her, and rattled at once into a recital of all the happenings on the islands: births, marriages, and deaths, sickness, courtship, and boat building, the price of market stuff, and the names of vessels newly arrived in the roads. But after a minute, she turned from him to my father. "'Tis all so narrow, sir, Seth's news. I want to know what's happening in the world." Now much was happening in those May weeks, much all over Europe, but much indeed in France, where Paris was passing through the sharp agonies of the Commune. The latest my father had to tell was almost a week old, but 2 days before we set sail for the islands, the Versailles troops had swept the boulevards, and every steamer had brought newspapers from the mainland. Mrs. Hicks's eyes grew bigger and rounder as she listened, but she had listened a very short while before she cried, "Father must hear this. He's up polishing the lantern, sir. Begging your pardon, but he must hear you tell it, he must indeed." With immense pride she added, "He was over to France one time." She marched us off to the lantern, up the winding stairway, up the ladder, and into the great glass cage, where stood an old man busily polishing the brass reflector. "Father, here's a gentleman come, with news from France." As the old man came forward with a fumbling step, my father drew a thick bundle from his coat pocket. "I brought you some newspapers," said he. "They will tell you more than I can." He held them out, but the wife interposed hurriedly. "Not to him, sir. Give them to Reuben, if you please, and thank you. But he, sir, he's blind." I looked as my father looked. A film covered both pupils of the old man's eyes. "He's been blind these 7 years," Reuben explained in a low voice. "Me and Sam are the regular keepers now, but the board lets him live on here, and he's terrible clever at polishing." "He knows the lamp so well as ever he did," broke in the old woman. "The leastest little scratch, he don't miss it. How he doesn't break his poor neck is more'n I can tell. But he don't, though 'tis a sore trial." While they explained, the old man's hand went out to caress the lamp, but stopped within an inch of the sparkling lenses. "Iss," said he musingly, "with this here cataract I misses a brave lot. There's a lot to be seen up here for a man with eyesight. Will you tell me, please, sir, what's the news from France? I was over there one time." It turned out he had once paid a visit to one of the small Breton ports, Roscoff, I think it was, and have a suspicion that smuggling lay at the bottom of the business there. "Well, now," he commented as my father told something of his tale, "I wouldn't have thought it of the Johnnies. They treated me very pleasant, and I speak of a man as I find him." He turned his sightless eyes on the family he had brought up to think well of Frenchmen. "They are different folk in Paris. That's a big place. Cherbourg's a big place too, they tell me. I came near going there one time, but my travelling's over. It do give a man something to think over, though. I wish my son here could have travelled a bit before settling down." But Reuben on the far side of the lantern was turning the pages of the tattered almanac. "Well, oh well," said the old woman. "A body must be thankful for good sons, and mine be that. But I love to end my days setting in a window and watching folks go by to church." It was past 7 o'clock when we hoisted sail again, and as we drew near the greater islands, a crimson flash shot out over the sea in our wake. On a dim beach ahead stood a girl waiting. End of section 24. Recording by Kyle Donnellan.